This is a curious film because obviously the whole Ice Age franchise, the series, they are very kid-friendly, very family-friendly. But this particular installment seems to have some quite adult references and adult jokes in it. It's not too much. It's not too much for children to cope with or anything. But I'll go into some detail about what exactly I mean by that. But let's talk about the content generally in the film, starting with the violence. So the violence is very much the comic book, slapstick, that kind of relentless stuff that happens all through the film. So the stuff like, characters fighting each other in a sort of a Scrabble kind of way, throwing things at each other, being hit with objects and things like that, falling down, bungeeing off cliffs and stuff. All that really sort of, I think slapstick actually best sums it up. Just that kind of a character falling through ice and the sort of stuff which is comic and a bit over the top and a bit zany and, being flung through the air or catapulted through the air, pinned down by another character, all that sort of stuff. That is everywhere through the film. So it's just constant. But you know the sort of stuff I mean, right? Okay, so there's that side of the violence. There's kind of two streams in this film. One of them happens on Earth, the other one happens in space. And most of the actual interesting stuff that I'd put in the violence category actually happens to our friend Scrat, who we all know and love, in space. And there's some really curious things that happen to him. So, for example, there's some amazing little scenes. There's an interesting gravity scene, and gravity does some quite bizarre things to this character. And stuff happens, like he gets pushed to the ground, he gets, his fur gets stripped off him and things like that. In fact, his whole skin gets stripped off him, leaving the skeleton. And, and this kind of thing. It's really, really amusing. And it's actually quite interesting because it's done in a way that kids should understand, or if they don't, then there's a chance to talk to them about gravity afterwards. There's a bit of a gravitational pull joke connected with that as well. So he kind of, he's victim to other things like being, hurtled through space and tied up and all this sort of stuff. He gets, slammed indoors repeatedly and so forth. So, again, as I know I'm saying it over and over again, but it's that kind of jokey violence which happens, and it mostly happens to him. So with blood and gore, there isn't really any blood or gore. You don't really see anything vicious or nasty happen to any of the characters. But there's one funny scene where the two saber-toothed tigers are eating grapes, and they end up having red grape juice around their fangs and around their mouths, and they accidentally scare some other creatures because it looks like blood. So there's a bit of a jokey reference there to blood, but there isn't actually any blood or gore through the film. So, but forgetting about the violence as such, the reason this film is rated PG is for the peril. And there is a little bit of peril in the film, and most of it is concerned with meteors crashing, screaming, I should say, toward Earth. And there's a lot of discussion about doomsday, the end of the world, the apocalypse, as these meteors are going to wipe out the planet. Or if not wipe out the planet, then most likely wipe out the population of the planet. And really interestingly in this film, I think this is quite rare in children's filmmaking. It's a whole sequence which explains what this means. Or, it's called cosmic cleansing. And this is actually explained to the kids. And I kind of find it really fascinating because usually kids' films don't bother to go into the science, either because they assume that kids won't understand it, or perhaps it's a little bit complicated to try and sort of, simplify it enough for kids to understand. But this film, at least in this part, actually kind of doesn't treat kids like idiots. It assumes that kids are smart enough that if it's explained to them, then they'll understand it. And it's absolutely explained in a way that anybody will understand. I mean, it helps that one character voiced by the one and only Neil deGrasse Tyson is the one that does the explaining. But I found that really intriguing. So there is this, this perilous, and this again goes through the whole film. The whole film is based on the idea that these meteors are due to collide with Earth, and it's what the characters are going to do about it, which provides the premise for the film. So, but it is explained about why it happens and what is going to happen. And again, this makes for some really interesting discussions after the film. I mean, is it going to happen again? Has it happened before? What were the dinosaurs here for? What happened? The theories that surround that. Even the idea of life on Mars. is mentioned and addressed during the film. So this is the interesting side that I found to the film. But that pretty much is, I guess, in a very small acorn-sized nutshell, the violence in the film. Getting on to the sex and nudity. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more adult. And of course, obviously, there is no sex or actual nudity in the film as such. But there's quite a few references to fairly adult themes. So it goes into discussing marriage. In fact, there is a wedding scene in the film. It talks about parenting and the trials of parenting. It talks about mating and couples mating for life or being a mate for life. So, and there is also some kissing and you know, some affection shown in the film. But I just found that interesting that, you know, it doesn't just sort of mention in a throwaway sense. Marriage and the idea of partnership is actually a theme through the film. So there might be questions asked leaving the film, depending on how observant and curious your child is. But yes, sex and nudity definitely has a presence in the film. I mean, nudity, the only thing I should mention, and I did mention it earlier, is where Scrat kind of loses his fur and he quickly kind of grabs to cover himself because there's just the idea that he's been stripped. Also in another scene, a character is singed quite badly, and you'll see this in the trailer. He turns around and his nipples are glowing. So, as I said, slightly adult. Moving on to alcohol and drugs. There are no drugs anywhere in the film, not surprisingly. Alcohol, well, there's a small alcohol reference. At the beginning of the film, there's some characters sitting at what looks like a bar, and a barman mixes them up a drink using a coconut shell, and there's kind of a bit of, you know, shaking and stirring and mixing of drinks going on. So it looks like they're drinking a cocktail. It doesn't say that they're drinking alcohol, but if you'd like to, you know, infer that, then I think it's a reasonable assumption to make. Now, getting on to offensive language. So there's no actual swearing in the film, but there are a lot of poo or poop jokes in the film. Why kids love them so much, I will never understand, but they do, and they're very present in this film. So, I mean, the word butt is used quite a lot, and poo and poopy is used a few times. I think we're at the worst of it is they're talking about, there's a reference made to licking something, licking a rock, and then there's this little rock-shaped thing shown, and one of the characters actually says, oh no, that's not a rock, that's a poo. And the screen is filled with this poo-shaped, yeah. So it's a bit yuck, and it's one of those things that you do have to question, did I really need to see that, and why did that have to go there, if you like. That's probably the only kind of weird, standout, unpleasant moment in the film. There's obviously lots and lots of animals throughout the film, so if you have a child that doesn't like certain animals, then have a look at the website and see what kind of creatures are listed. There's one scene that I just want to point out where a creature, it's set to an opera song, operatic tune. This creature sort of goes flying through the jungle, if you like, and bounces a lot on bungee kind of vines and things. And it's actually quite vertiginous. Watching that on a really big screen like I did, you do get that sense of kind of being thrown. He goes up and down these very, very tall cliffs a few times. So, you know, that's something that you have a bit of a upset tummy, or you tend to get queasy with fear of heights, then yeah, just be aware of that. It happens towards the beginning of the film. But I think that probably sums up film the best I can. I mean, it is family friendly, it is designed for kids. It just has this curious mix of light-hearted family innocence as well as not so innocent references. Yeah, no reason why you shouldn't take your kids to go and see it. If anything, it's quite sort of long because it's a very one-note premise and the narrative isn't particularly complicated. It's good because anyone will be able to follow it, but at the same time it does get a little bit bogged down, I think, in the middle where it gets a bit slow. So just be aware that if, you know, your kids might get a little bit restless, particularly small children, because it's a bit repetitive and nothing kind of new happens for a while. So they might begin to lose interest, but of course it's so colourful and so vibrant that most kids will just love, you know, watching what's going on the screen. So there's a much more detailed breakdown of the content on the website, so check that out if you like. But before you go, don't forget to subscribe.